Est-ce que vous êtes des gens sérieux?
Oui, très sérieux.
Et pourquoi? Pourquoi vous êtes sérieux? Pourquoi vous pensez que vous êtes sérieux?
What did you say?
Why do you think you're serious?
We're not really. Tell him I was lying.
Non, il est peut-être un peu taquin en disant ça.
Est-ce que dans la vie vous faites uniquement ce que vous aimez?
What?
Only do what you like.
Yes.
Est-ce que vous pensez que vous avez une influence en France sur le public français?
Je sais pas. Non, j'ai vu seulement Paris.
Hey everybody, how's it going? So this is going to be episode number 7 in my Rolling Stones deep dive into their London Records catalog. And today, the episode that many of you have been waiting for, we're going to be talking about this incredible album, the Rolling Stones Aftermath. Now, it was released in the UK on April 15th, 1965, and stayed at number 1 for 8 consecutive weeks, but it was not released in the US until July 2nd, 1966. I believe in large part that's because the Big Hits compilation had been released only the month prior, and so they didn't want to cut into the sales of that Greatest Hits album, so they delayed that release for a little while. Now, there are a few differences between the UK and the American version of the album. In the UK, you've got the album leading off with Mother's Little Helper, and in the US, they swapped that out with the recent single Paint It Black. And then they also removed 3 songs that were on the UK album from the US version to shorten the track list because, number one, in the US, you generally only had albums that were 11, 12 songs in length, and also because they wanted to be able to create another album down the road by using some of the leftover tracks. So the songs that are missing from the US version are Out of Time, Take It or Leave It, and What to Do. Take It or Leave It and What to Do, I don't feel are that big omissions. I think Out of Time would have definitely been a bonus to have included that on the US album, but they didn't, and so it would find a home on the Flowers compilation the following year, 1967. So Aftermath was the very first album to feature all Jagger Richards composition. And this was in trying to keep up with the Beatles, who Andrew Loog Oldham was always comparing the Rolling Stones to the Beatles, calling them kind of the darker, bad boy alternative to the Beatles. And he was very much encouraging Jagger and Richards to write songs in order to keep pace with the Beatles, who obviously were having tremendous commercial success. And the Rolling Stones in 1965 had a string of just amazing singles. And so the Rolling Stones were very much holding their own in early 1966. The albums that this album were competing with were, you had Rubber Soul by the Beatles, which had been released on December 3rd, 1965, and the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds had come out on May 16th, 1966, and taken critics and the music world by storm. Bob Dylan released Blonde on Blonde June 20th, 1966. And for the rest of the year, the Yardbirds on July 15th, 1966 would release their brilliant album Roger the Engineer. On July 18th, 1966, the Byrds would release their psychedelic offering, Fifth Dimension. And then in August 5th of 1966, the Beatles would release their follow-up to Rubber Soul, Revolver, which of course was a game changer. So it was such an amazing time in terms of just the way that rock was progressing, how quickly rock was evolving during those times. And Brian Jones was an integral part in keeping the Rolling Stones sound competitive with the Beatles and the Beach Boys. And this was really the stage where the balance of power in the Rolling Stones began to shift. In the early days of the Rolling Stones, Brian Jones was the undisputed leader of the band. He founded the band. He gave them their name. They were named after a Muddy Waters song. I believe it was written by Willie Dixon, but nonetheless. And in the UK, it was not unheard of that the lead singer was not considered the frontman or the leader of the band. You had the Spencer Davis Group. Obviously, Steve Winwood was a vocalist in that band, but it was still very much Spencer Davis's group. And Brian Jones was definitely viewed, at least in the UK, as the leader of the Rolling Stones. And as Jagger and Richards began to develop as songwriters, they really started to resent that, because Brian's contributions started to become less and less. As the Rolling Stones got more famous, Brian Jones was ill-equipped to handle it.
I always felt very sorry for Brian. He was two things. He was not very nice, and he upset people very easily. He wasn't very pleasant, I mean.
You know, when I think about it with Brian, when we were slogging away with no recognition, just doing what we're doing, you know, and quite enjoying it, but with no great ambitions or anything, he was a great guy.
Fame doesn't sit very comfortably on anyone's shoulders. But some people's shoulders doesn't seem to sit on at all. And he was one of them. And I don't think it suited him.
But within a very short amount of time, another guy was coming out. A Mimi. You know, and somebody you didn't suspect lurked in there. And this guy got bigger and bigger as the years went by, and also became more self-destructive. Now, I'm one to talk about that, right? But I'm still here, you know? And Brian went for it all the way, and once he was down that path, man, there's no stopping it.
Brian Jones, to his credit, though, did introduce some very exotic instruments on this album. Now, you had George Harrison, who had introduced the sitar on Norwegian Wood on the Rubber Soul album back in December of 1965. And you've got Brian Jones, who also features the sitar here. But you also have him introducing the marimba on Under My Thumb, as well as the Appalachian dulcimer. So Brian Jones was getting into some different palettes. He was definitely keeping the Rolling Stones in the race for who could come up with the most inventive, creative album. But after this album, that would start to gradually decrease. His participation, as he started to get more into drugs, as he started to have struggling with some more personal issues, Brian Jones' contributions would gradually start to decrease. And if you know anything about the history of the Rolling Stones, by 1969, he would be kicked out of the band, essentially, in the spring of 1969. Now, in contrast to the Beatles, who at this stage were still relatively singing about conventional love themes, you know, I love you, you love me, you broke up with me, you know, girlfriends who had done them wrong, the Rolling Stones were definitely getting into some darker territory with their lyrics, beginning with Aftermath, but definitely I think Aftermath contains some of the most darker themes that you would find on those early Rolling Stones albums. They're talking about drugs, sex, and death, and there's a lot of misogyny. As I talked about, I believe it was the Out of Our Heads episode, where Andrew Loog Oldham was definitely encouraging the Rolling Stones and some of the subject material that they were singing about. There's no denying there's a lot of unapologetic misogyny in the Rolling Stones lyrics. They're talking about, you know, women as being pill-popping housewives. They're shallow, they're materialistic, they're unintelligent, they're superficial. Rolling Stones don't have a whole lot of sentimentality when it comes to singing about love in their songs. Now, Brian Jones had started a relationship with an actress, Anita Pallenberg, who was considered very glamorous and definitely probably above his pay grade, to be honest. But the Rolling Stones were very jealous of that. As a matter of fact, Keith Richards eventually would enter into a relationship with Anita, kind of stole her away from Brian Jones. And that was one of the final nails in Brian Jones's psychological coffin, if you will, when that happened. But Mick Jagger was dating Chrissy Shrimpton, who was a model. And, you know, if you think some of Paul McCartney's lyrics, he was dating Jane Asher at the time. Some of Paul McCartney's lyrics, like "You won't see me, I'm looking through you, we can work it out." If you think those were unflattering portraits of his girlfriend at the time, some of Jagger's lyrics that were directed at his girlfriend at the time, Chrissy Shrimpton, are just brutal. We're talking "Stupid Girl," "Out of Time," "Under My Thumb." I mean, Paul McCartney doesn't hold a candle in the misogyny department to Mick Jagger when it comes to those lyrics. So anyway, let's get into and break down the music, the songs on this fantastic album. And by breakdown, I'm not a musicologist. I'm not going to tell you what key they're in, what chord changes there are, the tempo, all of that. I'm just going to tell you what I like and what's my favorite part. So on the US album, which we're talking about, it opens with the single Paint It Black. Now, Paint It Black was released in the US as a single on May 7th, 1966. The B-side was Stupid Girl. In the UK, it was released on May 13th, 1966, so almost a week later, and it had Long, Long While on the B-side. Paint It Black was, I think, the better choice to include on this album. I think it's a better song than Mother's Little Helper. I do like Mother's Little Helper, but I think Paint It Black is just a much better album opener, and I think it's a better track to include on this album.
Yeah, Paint It Black, I'm still wondering what it's about myself. I don't, it's one of those, it's very, I mean, to me, it's half gypsy and half Jewish sort of melody. And it went through so many different sort of convolutions before it ended up as the way that we know it now. All I is Mick asked me, what's it about? And I said, I don't know, it's just Paint It Black, you know. So I left so it's a genuine Jagger-Richards collaboration in which I gave him the riff, the song, and the basic idea, and then I left it to Mick to fill in the details, and Mick can be a bit convoluted at times, you know, but as I say, it's a great song to play on stage as well, and also it's just such a different rhythm, and I mean, sometimes you feel you don't write them, you know, I mean, you just happen to be there and receive them, and then you put them through the rest of the guys that you play with, and then somebody will come up with an idea or a rhythm that you say, oh, I'd never thought of that. And in a way, a lot of teamwork involved. And I think I think Bill Wyman ended up on B3 organ pedals instead of a bass as well. It was, I remember us working it, but it was a long time ago, RCA Hollywood, Sunset and Vine. But, yeah, because it is sort of slightly off the mainstream of the most of the other stuff. Where it came from, I don't know, but I claim the writing.
It's kind of got that punk attitude, sort of that snotty, dark, nihilistic themes that you would see in punk rock, like in the late 70s. So the Rolling Stones were really ahead of their time in that respect. And obviously we already talked about the instrumental creativity that Brian Jones brought to the table. Then you've got Stupid Girl, which is kind of a straightforward rocker. You got Mick Jagger singing about his girlfriend, Chrissy Shrimpton, although I don't think he would admit that at the time. The third track on here is Lady Jane, which is such a brilliant bit of Baroque pop. You never, ever heard a Rolling Stones song like this before. I think the closest you got might have been a song, you know, one of their slower songs, like As Tears Go By, or maybe even Play With Fire. But to hear this crazy, you know, stringed, it's like a dulcimer, I think it is at the beginning of that, at Rolling Stones, it had to have blown people's minds when they got to this track and heard it. But it was apparently inspired by Henry VIII love letters that he sent to Lady Jane Seymour. But I think it works effectively well, and it sounds amazing, especially on the remasters, the SACD remaster. It is one of my favorite songs on this album. Then you've got Under My Thumb with the marimba, which I've always loved the arrangement on here. That was one of my dad's favorite songs. He used to play it endlessly, and I love a good marimba, a good xylophone, and, you know, the lyrics notwithstanding, I think it is just a fantastic, brilliant song. Should have been a single. I can't believe this didn't get released as a single. It's crazy, but this is one of the best deep tracks that the Rolling Stones ever had. Then you've got the bluesy Don't You Bother Me, which I love that, you know, the Brian Jones slide guitar. I think it works so effectively, and it's a short song. It's only 2 minutes and 35 seconds long, but it is so cool. One of my favorite early blues tracks by the Rolling Stones. And then you've got the Think, which is okay. I mean, it's not certainly blowing anybody's minds, but I think it's an effective way to end side one. On side two, you've got Flight 505, which is essentially about a plane crash. And it's interesting because a year later, Pete Townsend would write a song. It was called Glow Girl, and it's about this girl and her plane is going down, and she's kind of lamenting the fact that she's pregnant and all the things that she's going to miss. Well, eventually that would evolve into the concept of Tommy, but the sex of the child would change to a boy. But nonetheless, you know, it's sort of interesting that bands who were on tour and who were flying constantly, it was in the back of their head, worried about, you know, like Buddy Holly's plane crash or Otis Redding, who would die a year later in a plane crash. You know, it was definitely an occupational hazard, especially aviation was not the safest means of transportation back in the 60s. So Flight 505 touches on that. Then you've got High and Dry, which kind of foreshadows sort of the country leanings that the Rolling Stones would get into on, you know, albums like Beggar's Banquet or Sticky Fingers or, you know, Country Honk on Let It Bleed. Sort of a, you know, like a jug band, hillbilly kind of romp. But I think it's very cool. I love that the Rolling Stones are branching out. They're not doing the R&B covers. They're not, you know, this is such, it's hard to really capture what a step forward this was for the Rolling Stones. When you compare this against Out of Our Heads, this was a giant leap forward. I mean, we're talking almost A Hard Day's Night jumping to Rubber Soul without you know, having Beatles for Sale and Help in the middle. It was like, holy cow, how did we get here? It's Not Easy, another straight ahead rocker, which I think works pretty well. Again, I Am Waiting. Where the hell did that come from? Nothing. Rolling Stones never recorded anything remotely like this ever before on an album. It's just a brilliant track. And it's such a mature song as well. I mean, you've got where they're down in the gutter and they're, you know, talking about women horribly, singing about, you know, the women that they don't respect. And then you've got such an elevated song like I Am Waiting. You know, that juxtaposition, I hate to say it, but I think it's brilliant and I love it and it works so well. And then I contend the last song on here is the weak link on this album. You've got the 11-minute and 35-second Going Home. And this is where what I feel drags this album down. Every song up to this point had been fantastic. And then you got Going Home, which is, I'm sorry, it's kind of a pedestrian blues song. And why they had to have this song go on for 11 minutes, I have absolutely no idea. When they could have trimmed it down, they could have squeezed out of time on here, but they didn't. And I got to tell you, I listened to about 3-4 minutes of this tops, and then I'm out. I'm just done. I'm glad it's at the end because you can switch it off, and, you know, that's that. Okay, so copies that I own of this album. I've got a stereo copy, which is in great shape. One of my few Rolling Stones album that has very little ring wear and no seam splits and is in pretty fantastic shape. This is the beautiful, I love that London label. I've got such sentimental feelings for that. And then I've got a beat up mono copy here. Mono, that's on the red, kind of a redder, less maroon London Records label. And then the back cover there, with those cool photographs, just a little bit of liner notes there. These are actually the singles that I've got. This is Mother's Little Helper with Lady Jane on the flip, and then Paint It, Black, which is interesting because they would remove the comma, I think, after the 60s. Then you got Stupid Girl on the flip there. My CDs copy, this is the original CD release, which all these Abco CDs more or less look the same. And then this is the SACD version. And the disc itself, it's again a customized CD there. And then I do have a, what I got this? This is the UK, my UK SACD version of Aftermath. And then I do have Aftermath on cassette. This was, I think, an 80s reissue of the cassette. And that's what that looks like. So, anyway, that is my deep dive into this fantastic album, Aftermath. Let me know what you think in the comment section. And next time, we're going to be talking about the first Rolling Stones live album. See you later.